I didn't change my life through big decisions. I changed it through small habits that no one ever noticed. And that's why I reached 100 years with peace, while many spend their entire lives trying to change everything at once and end up changing nothing. For a long time, I also believed that transformation came from grand moments, from radical decisions, from major turning points. I kept waiting for that moment when everything would finally make sense, and from there, my life would completely change. But that moment never came, because it simply doesn't exist. It was only over the years, by observing my own mind and following the teachings of the Buddha, that I understood something quiet and deeply true. Life doesn't change in big events. It changes in the small things you do every single day, almost without noticing. And it's exactly these small actions, repeated in silence, that shape who you become. I began to notice that people spend their lives waiting for big changes while ignoring the small habits that are slowly destroying or building their lives. They want peace, but they start their day in chaos. They want clarity, but they feed confusion. They want transformation, but they repeat the same patterns every day. That's when I stopped searching for big answers and started adjusting small things. Simple habits, almost invisible, that didn't require extreme effort, but did require awareness. And over time, something began to change in a deep way, not all at once, but from the inside out, in a quiet and irreversible way. Today, after 100 years of observing life closely, I can tell you clearly, it's not the big decisions that change your destiny. It's the small habits you practice every day, even when no one is watching. That's why I'm going to reveal the 10 small habits that quietly change your life starting today. 10 simple, silent habits that completely transformed my life. The first habit that changed my life was starting the day in silence, and the second was not carrying yesterday into it. It may sound too simple, but this is exactly where everything began to transform. For many years, I would wake up already being pulled by my thoughts. Before even getting out of bed, my mind was already filled with worries, memories, unfinished matters, and emotions from the day before. It was as if each new day wasn't truly new, just a continuation of a weight I had never released. That's when I realized something few people notice. The way you begin your day defines the quality of your mind. And if your mind begins full, it remains confused. Within Buddhist teachings, there is a clear understanding of this. The mind needs space to see clearly, and that space only exists when you don't overload it the moment you wake up. So I started doing something different. When I woke up, I didn't reach for anything, didn't seek stimulation, didn't dive into thoughts. I simply stayed in silence for a few minutes, observing my breath, allowing my mind to wake up along with my body, without rush and without interference. And along with that, I practiced something even more important. I stopped bringing yesterday with me. I stopped replaying conversations, reopening situations, carrying emotions that had already passed. I began to treat each morning as it truly is, a beginning. At first, my mind resisted. It wanted to go back to the same patterns, wanted to revisit problems, wanted to stay in control. But I no longer fed that. I simply returned to silence, returned to the present, returned to the now. And over time, something very subtle began to happen. My days became lighter.
Because when you stop starting your day carrying what has already passed, you finally create space to live what is actually happening. If you truly want to change your life, don't start by trying to change everything.
Just begin by observing how you wake up, because that's where your mind quietly decides what the rest of your day will be like. If you enjoy this kind of content, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from so I can like your comment and subscribe to the channel, my friend. Let's continue. The third habit that changed my life was learning to observe before reacting. This was one of the hardest because for most of my life, I believed that reacting quickly was a sign of intelligence, awareness, and control. But over time, I realized that most reactions don't come from clarity, they come from conditioning. I began to notice that in any situation, my mind already had ready-made responses. Someone would say something, and I would immediately interpret, judge, and respond internally before truly understanding. And this created unnecessary conflicts, invisible exhaustion, and above all, decisions that were not conscious, they were automatic. Within Buddhist teachings, there is a very simple yet deeply transformative practice: observation without attachment. This means you don't need to react to everything that arises. You can simply observe what is happening inside you before acting. And that's exactly what I started practicing. Whenever something bothered me, I didn't respond immediately. I didn't try to fix it, didn't try to defend myself, didn't try to control the situation. I simply observed what arose within me, the emotion, the impulse, the thought. And in that small space between stimulus and reaction, I began to find freedom. Because when you react without observing, you are controlled by what happens outside. But when you observe before reacting, you begin to act from within. And that difference completely changes how you live. Over time, I realized that many problems simply stopped existing when I didn't react in the usual way. Situations that would have turned into conflict passed. Emotions that once dominated dissolved. And decisions that were once impulsive became conscious. If you observe your own life, you'll notice that most of your exhaustion doesn't come from what happens, but from how you react to what happens. And maybe the change you're looking for is not in controlling the world, but in creating a small space within yourself before any reaction. The fourth and fifth habits that changed my life were learning to reduce excess and protect my energy. These two go hand in hand because everything that is excessive ends up draining what is essential. For many years, I didn't realize how surrounded I was by excess. Excess of things, excess of information, excess of worries, excess of relationships that occupied space but did not bring presence. And the problem with excess is that it doesn't present itself as something negative. It disguises itself as normal. I believed I needed more to live better. More stimulation, more connection, more activity, more answers. But over time, I began to realize that the more I accumulated, the more tired I became. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was a silent burnout, as if my mind never truly rested. That's when I understood something very clear within Buddhist philosophy. What you don't need becomes a burden, even if it seems small. And this burden doesn't show up immediately. It builds over time until you can no longer see what truly matters. I began to remove excess consciously, not in a radical way, but with awareness. I started questioning what truly needed to remain in my life and what was simply taking up space. And by doing that, something began to emerge: lightness. But along with that, I understood something even more important. It's not enough to remove excess if you continue to allow your energy to be invaded. Because there are things you cannot control outside, but you can choose how far they enter within you. So I began to protect my energy, not exposing myself to everything, not absorbing everything, not reacting to everything. I started to be more selective about what I listened to, who I engaged with, and what I allowed to remain in my mind. And this was not an act of distancing myself from the world. It was an act of respect toward myself. Because when you reduce excess and protect your energy, you begin to notice something very simple yet transformative. You don't need more to live better. You need less to live with clarity. The sixth habit that changed my life was creating spaces of silence within the mind. And this is different from simply being quiet on the outside, because many people are in silent environments, yet carry an internal noise that never stops. For a long time, I believed that silence was just the absence of sound, a moment without conversation, without activity, without external distractions. But even when everything around me was quiet, my mind kept talking, remembering, judging, anticipating, creating scenarios that never existed. It was a constant flow that I didn't know how to stop. That's when I understood something essential within Buddhist teachings. The problem is not the thought itself, but the way you attach to it. The mind naturally produces thoughts, but when you engage with all of them, you create an internal noise that never ends. I began to observe this more closely. I realized I didn't need to force my thoughts to stop, nor fight against them. I simply needed not to follow them. Whenever a thought arose, I would just acknowledge it and let it pass without going deeper, without feeding it, without turning it into a larger story. At first, it felt impossible. The mind kept pulling my attention, wanting me to continue, wanting me to resolve, judge, or react. But I would gently return to silence. Not a forced silence, but a space where I didn't need to participate in everything that appeared. And within that space, something began to change deeply. The mind started to slow down, not because thoughts disappeared, but because I stopped engaging with all of them. And when you do that, something very rare happens. You begin to experience clarity. Because a silent mind is not an empty mind. It is a mind that is not overloaded. If you feel like your mind never rests, that you are always thinking, always worried, always anticipating something, maybe the problem isn't the number of thoughts, but how much you engage with each one of them. And when you learn to create this inner space, even if only for a few moments throughout the day, you begin to experience something most people spend their entire lives searching for: peace. The seventh and eighth habits that changed my life were learning to do less, but with full presence, and taking care of what no one sees. These two habits may seem simple, but they were responsible for a transformation I couldn't achieve for many years while trying to do more, try harder, and chase more. For much of my life, I believed that productivity meant doing as much as possible, filling every moment, always staying in motion. I thought that the more I did, the closer I was to living well. But what I didn't realize was that by doing so much, I wasn't truly present in any of it. My mind was always on the next step, the next task, the next outcome. And this created a constant sense of incompleteness, as if nothing was ever enough, as if everything was always halfway done, even when I had already done so much. That's when I understood something profound within Buddhist philosophy. It's not the quantity of what you do that transforms your life. It's the quality of presence you bring into each action. And when there is no presence, even the most important things become empty. I began to reduce, not just tasks, but the internal rush. I started doing fewer things throughout the day, but with real attention, with awareness, with full presence. And by doing that, something changed completely. What once seemed small began to gain meaning, and what once was automatic began to feel alive. And along with that came the eighth habit: taking care of what no one sees. Because there is a part of life that is invisible to others: your thoughts, your intentions, your choices when no one is watching, the way you treat yourself in silence, the way you act when you have nothing to prove. And it was in that unseen space that I realized where true transformation happens. For a long time, I focused on what was visible, what could be recognized, what others could perceive. But what truly shaped my life was happening far from any eyes, within me. So I began to take care of that. I started observing my intentions, the way I thought, the way I reacted internally, even when no one knew. Because I understood that the life you live inside inevitably becomes the life you live outside. And when you learn to do less with presence and take care of what no one sees, you stop living to impress and start truly living. The ninth habit that changed my life was learning to accept what is without resistance. This was perhaps one of the most difficult, because the human mind is trained to resist constantly, to resist what it doesn't like, resist what it doesn't understand, resist what it cannot control. For many years, I lived trying to adjust life to my expectations. When something didn't happen the way I wanted, I became frustrated. When someone acted differently than I expected, I felt disturbed. When reality didn't match what I imagined, I created conflict within myself. And by observing this pattern, I realized something very clear. The suffering was not in what was happening, it was in my resistance to what was happening. Within Buddhist teachings, there is a deep understanding of this. Pain may be inevitable, but suffering arises when you fight against reality. Because life does not follow your will, it follows its own flow. And the more you try to control that flow, the more you exhaust yourself. I began to practice something simple, yet transformative. In any situation, before reacting, before judging, before trying to change it, I accepted it.
Not as resignation, not as giving up, but as clarity. I acknowledged what was happening exactly as it was. And in that moment, something shifted. Because when you accept what is, you stop wasting energy fighting what is already happening. And that energy begins to turn into presence, into understanding, into conscious action. Over time, I noticed that many things that once caused me suffering simply stopped carrying the same weight. Not because life changed, but because I stopped resisting it. If you observe your own experience, you will notice that much of your exhaustion doesn't come from events, but from the way you insist they should be different. And when you learn to accept what is, you don't lose control. You gain freedom. Now that you've made it this far, I have a request. Subscribe to the channel to receive more videos, and if you enjoyed this, leave a like and watch the other videos on the channel.